Good morning, class.
A lanky man with glasses walked into the classroom.
My name is Mr. Jameson.
He wrote his name on the board.
I'll be your history teacher until Mrs. Rose comes back from maternity leave.
I smiled as I envisioned the next 3 months to be a breeze. There wasn't a teacher at school that did not like me. Mr. Jameson, however, wasn't any ordinary teacher. Little did I know at that point in time he would change my life for the worst. Watch my story to the end and let me know if you've ever had a substitute teacher like Mr. Jameson. The first thing Mr. Jameson did as the substitute teacher was to implement a no-device policy. He collected all our devices at the beginning of class and placed them in a box on his table until class was over. I soon realized that he didn't want me or the other children taping him to show other adults how mean he really was. It didn't take me long to realize that Mr. Jameson had a personal vendetta against me. I had no idea what I did wrong. He always picked on me, and my grade was the only grade he ever called out in class. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but then I realized Mr. Jameson was as mean as they came. One time, while I was absent from school, the entire class got in trouble because there was a fight in class. When I arrived the next day, Mr. Jameson said that even though I wasn't there, I still needed to do detention. You know, the Peter pay for Paul type scenario? I told Mr. Jameson that it was unfair that I'd have to do detention since I wasn't at school. Do you know what he did? He gave me a week's detention. A whole week. And then he called my parents and told them that I needed to adjust my attitude if I wanted to reach anywhere in life. When I got home, I tried to explain what happened to my parents, but they wouldn't listen.
We raised you better than this, Ronald.
Mom glared at me. Mom, I didn't do anything. I simply told Mr. Jameson that I wasn't at school. Why should I be punished for something I didn't do?
You could have stated that without being rude to Mr. Jameson,
Dad said. I groaned. My parents just didn't get it. They told me if Mr. Jameson had to call them again about my behavior, that I'd be grounded for 2 months. Can you believe it? If I was going to get detention or grounded, I would earn my punishment. It was time to pull some pranks on Mr. Jameson. A week after my detention, I decided it was time to seek my revenge. Don't worry, I didn't do anything too outrageous. I must admit, it did feel strange, but so satisfying. I got to class before everyone and emptied a bottle of water on Mr. Jameson's plush teacher's chair. I sat anxiously waiting for Mr. Jameson as my classmates entered the class and sat down. Mr. Jameson came to class and immediately started teaching. After about 10 minutes, he sat down.
What in the world?
He jumped up from the chair, his face enraged, and he touched the back of his chair.
Who did this?
He shouted at the class. Johnny and some of his friends at the back of the class snickered. Mr. Jameson charged towards them.
Did you do this? No, Mr. Jameson,
Mr. Jameson snatched Johnny and the guy next to them and marched out of the classroom. Once he left, the classroom burst into an uproar and we laughed at what just happened. 15 minutes later, Mr. Jameson returned to class and demanded that we pack away our books. We got a quiz that day and every student in the class failed. Our parents weren't pleased. After doing the water prank and hearing children whisper among themselves as to how great it was, I decided to pull another prank the next day. The adrenaline rush was nothing like I've ever felt before. I brought some of my father's heavy-duty glue from home and spread it under the teacher's table. By the time Mr. Jameson came to class and everyone was seated, it was as though they were waiting for something to happen. Before he sat down, Mr. Jameson felt his chair to ensure it was dry. Once that was out of the way, he sat and began the class. When he tried to get up from the chair, his shoes were stuck. This time, the class didn't care about Mr. Jameson's punishment. They laughed and pointed as Mr. Jameson needed to get the help of the janitor, Joe, an elderly man, to pry his shoes from the tiles. Mr. Jameson gave the class a week's detention, but we didn't care. The fact that someone stood up to that evil teacher was good enough. I basked in the fact that I was the one to make it happen. But just like everything in life, all good things must come to an end. The next day, I asked Mr. Jameson if I could go to the bathroom.
Sure.
A smile curved his lips.
If you can beat me in a fight.
I raised my eyebrow. Excuse me?
You heard what I said. If you can beat me in a fight, then you can go to the bathroom.
Feeling as though I had something to prove, I decided to go for it. At least this time, my peers would know that I was the one that took Mr. Jameson down. Mr. Jameson pushed the tables to the side and then stood in the middle of the classroom. I launched myself towards Mr. Jameson, and in 20 seconds flat, I was gasping for air as I lay on my back.
Access to the bathroom denied.
Mr. Jameson said before he crossed over me and headed back to his desk. Everything in me wanted to run home and tell my parents about Mr. Jameson's bullying tactics, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. I needed proof of Mr. Jameson's behavior before I went to any adult. A few of my peers tried to record Mr. Jameson's behavior, but they were all caught. I stopped enjoying school. My grades dropped drastically, and I felt as though all the life I had was drained from me. One afternoon, while doing my homework, I heard the doorbell ring. Then a few seconds later, Mom called me down for dinner. When I walked into the kitchen, my heart stopped. There he was, Mr. Jameson, sitting by the table with Mom and Dad. What is he doing here? I asked.
Hey, Ronald, how are you? Your mother invited me to dinner so we could discuss your grades.
Then Mr. Jameson smiled. I thought his face was going to crack. I had never seen Mr. Jameson smile or speak pleasantly to anyone before. He always had a gruff tone about him, but there he was laughing and smiling with my parents. I must be dreaming, I said aloud. Mom laughed.
You are very much awake. Now come and join us for dinner.
That wasn't the only surprise that night. During dinner, I found out that Mr. Jameson and Mom used to date in high school. I spat my drink out. What? I turned to Dad. And you're okay with him sitting at your kitchen table eating your food? Dad chuckled.
Ronald, that was a long time ago, and as far as I'm concerned, I won in the end.
He winked at me. Did Mr. Jameson's face change after Dad's comment, or did I imagine that? It happened so quickly. After dinner, Mr. Jameson said he needed to leave, and once he did, I breathed a sigh of relief. Mom, what did you see in him?
He's not as bad as you think.
If not, why didn't you marry him instead of Dad?
Well,
Mom said carefully.
I liked him, but not enough to see myself living the rest of my life with him. I had to be true to what I felt, so I told him that I thought we should see other people. A few weeks later, I met your dad, and the rest is history.
You'd think that after he came to my house, mingled with my parents, and had dinner with us, Mr. Jameson's attitude towards me would change. Wrong. It seemed as though he got 10 times worse. I felt worthless and defeated. One afternoon, I sat on one of the courtyard benches before going home. Tears welled in my eyes as the realization came to me that Mr. Jameson knew who I was before he entered the class on the first day. I was the son of an ex who broke his heart. By ill-treating me, he probably thought that it would hurt my mother. But how in the world could she be hurt if she didn't believe it was happening? The only person he was hurting was me. Joe, the janitor, passed by with his bucket and mop. He stopped, looked at me, and sat down. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. I felt as though all my frustration, hurt, and anger seeped through my pores. Before I knew it, I was spilling my guts to Joe, who sat attentively and listened. Now I'm at a place where I don't like school. I can't talk to my parents about it because they think I'm lying. Now we're hearing Mrs. Rose might never return. When did life become so difficult? Joe looked at me and calmly replied,
Everything in life is only for a season. No season lasts forever, but how you react to a bad season can compromise the blessing you should receive in your good season. Continue to put your best foot forward. Everything always works out in the end.
Joe winked at me before he got up and wheeled his bucket and mop down the courtyard. The next day, I went to school with a different mindset. I kept what Joe told me close to my heart. No matter what Mr. Jameson threw at me, I was going to put my best foot forward. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked hard and my grades improved. Mom even dropped off a fruit basket for Mr. Jameson one day to thank him for helping me improve my grades. Things seemed to be looking up. I noticed that if I didn't show emotion when Mr. Jameson mistreated me, he seemed to back off. I started to believe things were getting back to a sense of normalcy, and I was happy to go to school once again.
Okay, class, today we're going to take this class outside.
Mr. Jameson said.
We are going to discuss some of the historical landmarks right here at the school.
My classmates and I were just happy to get out of the classroom. After 30 minutes of discussing the landmarks of the school, Mr. Jameson told us to use the bathroom before we came back to class. By the time we got back to class, Mr. Jameson was there waiting for us. To end the class, he gave us homework and went to pack away his books into his bag. The bell rang, and as we got up to leave, Mr. Jameson stopped us.
I'm missing my phone. Who has my phone?
My classmates and I looked at each other confused.
One of you little rugrats stole my phone. I will check every bag before you leave the classroom.
We lined up and waited for Mr. Jameson to look through our bags. When he got to mine, he emptied all the contents onto his desk. There it was, a phone I had never seen before.
I'm going to call the police,
he fumed as he grabbed his phone from the table. I didn't steal your phone. You probably planted it there when you came back to class. I am not a thief, I yelled. I was sick and tired of Mr. Jameson.
You can tell that to the police.
Mr. Jameson and I yelled back and forth at each other until Principal Gray walked into the classroom.
What is going on in here, Mr. Jameson?
Mr. Jameson told Principal Gray that I stole his phone and he was just about to call the police.
I don't think that will be necessary, Mr. Jameson. I am sure there is a better way.
Is nobody listening to me? I didn't steal Mr. Jameson's phone. He's just jealous that Mom broke up with him and married my dad. Before Principal Gray could respond, Joe walked into the classroom.
What's going on? Mind your business, old man,
Mr. Jameson snarled.
When someone spills something, then we will call for you.
Mr. Jameson stepped towards Joe and Principal Gray stepped between them.
Joe, this isn't your concern.
Joe, Mr. Jameson here is accusing me of stealing his phone, and he said he's going to call the police.
Is that so?
Joe looked up and down at Mr. Jameson with a critical eye. Without another word, Joe walked to the back of the class. He picked up a camera that was hidden between two books and walked to Principal Gray. He rewound the tape and played it for Principal Gray. On the tape, it showed Mr. Jameson putting his phone into my bag before his students returned to class.
If you need more evidence, I have the tapes from the last 3 days. Ever since Ronald told me about his mishaps with Mr. Jameson, I knew I had to do something. I saved up some money and purchased a camera. No child should have to be intimidated by a teacher. Shame on you, Mr. Jameson.
Mr. Jameson, meet me in my office now.
Principal Gray said and walked out of the classroom. Mr. Jameson stepped towards me and Joe tapped him on the shoulder with his mop from behind.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Mr. Jameson grumbled something under his breath before he grabbed his belongings and exited the classroom. I thanked Joe and invited him to have dinner with my family that evening. During dinner, I told my parents what happened in school that day and how Joe came to the rescue. My parents thanked Joe and apologized to me. Mr. Jameson was fired and we never saw him again. To anyone who's listening out there, keep speaking up and find an adult who will listen, and eventually, just as Joe said, everything works out in the end.